Welcome to the Tao of Sports podcast with Troy Kirby, covering sports business with over 300 industry leaders from across the globe. Now, here is your host, Troy Kirby.
Thank you for listening to the Tao of Sports podcast. I'm Troy Kirby, along with episode 885 of the podcast. Today's guest is one of my friends from Canada. That is Paul Fruitman. He used to work at the Whitecaps. He's worked at the Toronto Blue Jays. I've had him on the podcast before, but now he's gone out on his own. He's looking more at insights, especially on the corporate sales front, really interactive on understanding that sort of model, and wanted to really kind of catch up with him, discuss exactly what he's been up to, as well as just how everything has changed. I know we're going to get a little repetitive for a while with what you did during the pandemic, which is like what you did during your summer break. But, you know, let's be honest, that affected everybody. And because it affected everybody, people kind of threw out what they had done before, and they kind of went a little different with everything. It's great to kind of hear from Paul Fruitman and some of the dynamics that he chose to do. And I thought it would be really great right here on episode 885 of the Tao of Sports.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. The whole idea of rights holders and, what type of insights they need, while we can say that was something that data had been using for a long time, let's be honest. A lot of times, sometimes people made up the data. What have we done since even COVID to kind of change that mindset?
That's a great question. Data is a big thing, I think, at any angle. And you're right. You can kind of, use statistics to back something up and cement an argument in the way you see fit. What I would say is one of the things that the pandemic did was show us some of the real things that we have to deal with. And, it came down to more of an emotional play than data. And I think that forced us to look at real issues, how people are feeling, how do they actually view our product emotionally, how is it helping them participate in their daily lives? And I think it's pushed it to where the data is only a small portion to back up on the quantitative side, but you still need the qualitative insights to really get a beat on what people are thinking and seeing and feeling about your brand.
But don't we think that some of that was just driven by the idea, obviously sports are eyeballs. People are looking at eyeballs, so they're looking at sports and not really taking into account that might not be true.
Well, let me flip the question back. Because when we talked about this, maybe a decade ago, the landscape of where viewership came from was substantially smaller. So, how are we even phrasing that when we say eyeballs? What does that even mean anymore? Because you're talking about, television viewership, cable and online and streaming and, replays and specific, sports rights driven highlight packages like Red Zone. And there's so many different resources now for people to participate. How are we even defining that? And I think that goes back to your first question is, I think we need to take a relook at what we're saying in the terms of what data actually is. What are the semantics that actually make sense now for the way that the sports industry has kind of changed?
Well, do we mistake buzzwords for actual progress in this type of arena? Like the idea that we can say fast data, soft data, slow data, all this kind of stuff kind of went away the second we could say AI. I mean, we don't really measure what we can and can't do. We just have the buzzword right attached to it to be able to sell to corporate America.
So, that's actually an interesting point is who's making up the definitions? Because, you're right. You could decide what the meaning is for yourself, and that may not mean the same thing to someone else. And if you're using the same terminology, it can become confusing. So, when you're touching on new technology as an example, when you say things like AI or NFT or blockchain, it definitely has a different meaning for each person. So when you're trying to apply that to data, then, I think you're already muddying what the data actually means, because my definition of that term might be completely different than yours.
So then this comes back to the idea, what do rights holders actually want? I mean, and by the way, we use this in a blanket term. I think a lot of times they're individuals, but do we even ask the rights holders what it is that they're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think we do. I think we also make a lot of assumptions. And I think that assumption comes down to the essence that this is still a business on all sides. So I think it comes down, we almost assume that it just has to come down to money and revenue. Participation notwithstanding, if people aren't paying to play, how are you supposed to manage and run a business without any revenue of any kind? So I think you have to ask, but I think we can safely assume too that there's still business functions that have to be satisfied to make us successful. And those are pretty commonplace across any industry: revenue, sales, engagement, getting people to purchase and buy, and having clients. That's what makes us a survivable entity.
Well, I always wonder if maybe we just try to slap a sign on something. We just try to slap a name on something rather than going deep down and asking these folks, does that even work for you? I mean, is this an ROE and a return on ego play, or is this something that you actually need to see tangible results from?
So I think connecting all the dots of what we started talking here, that leads to, when you look at how people are selling and buying assets, and you're right, sometimes we're so driven by budget lines that we're not looking at the return on investment for our clients as much as we're looking on the return, of investment to our bottom line. And I think that when you look at the recent examples of, new technology companies like all the, crypto.com and all those ones that are coming in and signing these major deals, it's being driven more by, hey, we have to hit budget, and these other companies saying we got to get reach, but nobody's asking the in-between question of saying, does it make sense to invest at that level? Or to your point, are we just playing to the ego because it's sports and it looks cool?
Well, that comes from anything, but my question is whether or not this actually turns us into another 2008 situation where they've jumped in, they can always jump out really quick.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're playing that danger is kind of always going to be there. The industry and entertainment is always so fluid and has so many factors that come into play, whether internal or external. You're always playing a high risk game because there's so much we can't control. Like winning and losing is a really good example. You may pay a high investment for a team that has a really good brand, but then let's say that they are under 500 for the entire season. How do you now pare down the value on both sides to say, if I'm a client, I'm going to say, look, this isn't impactful for me. But if I'm the brand, I'm saying, look, I'm still the number one brand in the country and there's value there. And so I think that risk is always going to intermingle with any sort of activity that we take in this business.
Well, one of the things that's, of course, different is Europe and Canada. Europe and, the wilds of BC, right? Most people don't understand Canada, and they all think that you're kind of, the same depending on the province. But you're also dealing with American style, sales, which may not be relatable to Canada.
Well, I think it's less about the sales and more about the lay of the land, where because we don't have the same volume of corporate companies at such high levels, you only have a few that continue to invest across the entire sports landscape. And you might assume that the sports landscape isn't big, but you still have soccer, hockey, basketball, baseball. The challenge is less about the selection of sports and more about the selection of companies that are going to be able to invest at a high level. So you tend to lose out pretty quickly where, you look at NASCAR as an example, when they lost tobacco sponsorship and was able to turn around into telecom, and then they've moved into other areas where there are more companies available to pay that high fee. Where when you come across the border and you look at things like, CFL or MLS, where the broadcast is regionalized, or hockey, you're focusing on Canadian companies, but there's a lot less to go to. So that's why you only have, either Rogers or Bell or TELUS or Shaw. And then after that, if they're invested, or BMO or Royal, they're going to invest in one thing, not all of it. And so it's more the flip side, whereas teams, you're sort of chasing the same dollar cyclically. if I use that word correctly.
Well, even if you didn't, you're a Canadian, which means that you're much more polite than I am. The other part of that is, though, that, with these companies, especially up in Canada, you have a lot more traditional. I always think of Rogers Sugar, something that's never going to go in my lifetime, your lifetime, etc. Are they necessarily really, looking for activation growth? Or is it more of, hey, this is hockey, this is what we do, this is what we're going to support?
You actually have seen that already with beer is a really good example where for a long time, Molson and Labatt's who are, competing with each other. And this is obviously before, Labatt's was brought by Interbrew way back and before Molson became Molson Coors. Molson had Molstar Sports and they owned the Canadians. They owned two of the Champ Car races that used to happen here. And they had a lot of investment in sports properties. And eventually they kind of sat down and said, look, we own, 50+% of the beer market. It doesn't make sense to throw millions of dollars. We just can't grow the brand anymore. It's already got as high an equity as it can. So they pulled out. They sold Molstar. They got out of the racing. They got out of the hockey business, and now they just sell beer. And so I think you do have that happening where companies at some point they just max out on their brand relevance, and if they're staying in as a partner, it's probably more to leverage the community side than it is for brand building because they just don't really need it anymore.
Well, are Canadians different in that sense that as a Canadian consumer, do they follow a lot more of the traditional things that, well, Molson supports this team, so I'm just in on it? Or does that change now that you have what you mentioned, this whole kind of flip of divestion against, said traditional brands?
It's an interesting question, and I don't think that is much a domestic thing as much as it's a change in your demographics, where you're seeing the rollover from older, more traditional sports fans, in their 55 plus range, who are used to seeing, more straightforward kind of partnerships and promotions, where now you're having a much younger demographic who are looking for a much larger variety of interaction with their properties. They're not spending the same amount of time, viewing 2 hours of game time. They're coming in blips and blabs of watching highlights and key plays and the interest in a player more than the team. So I think what it's doing is it's forcing the hand of clubs to start looking for more smaller and unique and really highly targeted opportunities. And so on both sides, I think it's changing the game where it's bringing in a new demographic who view differently, but it's also opening up the door to, maybe medium and smaller level partnerships for companies that might not have the financial backing to spend $10 million a year, but can spend, $250,000 a year. So I don't even know if there's a real answer yet. I think we're going through a period of flux as the generations start to roll over.
Well, this also becomes, somewhat of a US versus Canada thing in the sense of what we watch in terms of sport and what we just kind of ignore. Maybe it's the NHL is a tier 5 sport, tier 4 sport, if you want to get to that in the US. I mean, in Canada, it's like a religion, but is that also being a little bit defeated by what the MLS has been allowed to do, which might actually kind of encroach into some of that stuff because the MLS has caught that younger consumer up in Canada?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is more our broadcast is what keeps the difference at bay. When you look at the American and the US sports broadcast market, there's so much, not just content, but you've got national players and regional players and online rights holders and so much more visual ability to participate and distribute, where in Canada you only have so much bandwidth. So you have TSN and Sportsnet, and Sportsnet 360, and we get DAZN, but realistically you're tied to their broadcasts. So when you look at things like the NBA or MLB or NHL, all their online packages. In the States, you can pretty much watch every single game. It doesn't matter where you are unless it's national. Problem is that when it's national in Canada, that's usually the team that you're going to watch. And so you're forced to go to either a traditional broadcaster or you're not watching that game. So the opportunity to participate is definitely more substantial south of the border than it is in Canada as a viewer.
Well, some of that also comes into the context of, even if you looked at the NFL or a lot of these things, you mentioned blackouts. Blackouts used to happen all the time because based off of attendance in the stands, or the old Bill Wirtz model, for the Chicago Blackhawks. We're just not going to show it at home because we want you to show up at the game. Does that really play anymore? And does that actually affect the sponsor or, these rights holders in general? Because they still want their stuff shown, especially if they're going to have it in your arena.
Yeah, I mean, blackouts are deadly for partners, obviously, because so much of your signage in the digital space, and by digital I mean whether it's board signage or rink signage or LED, is meant to be television broadcast. As much as you're getting the eyes in the stadium, you're capping out at your capacity, and sponsors aren't paying to see 35,000 eyes a game. They're paying to see 300,000 or a million, just depending on what your broadcast is. So I think that the blackout concept, although it periodically creeps back into the discussion, I think it's very antiquated. There's so many different routes for people to participate, like we discussed. A blackout is a band-aid to nothing. And if I really want to participate as a viewer, whether going to the game or watching it, you almost can't prevent me from doing that. So I think the only thing that a blackout does is it more forces the viewer to watch the national broadcasts, but I'm not going to attend the game just because I can't see it on TV. And then throw in the fact that, if the game happens to sell out at some point, then what am I supposed to do? If I can't watch it and I can't go, then I'm just not going to participate. And if that's what a sponsor is paying for, they don't want to pay for the loss. They're paying for gains. So I think it doesn't help the game.
Well, so you mentioned all this and sounds great, but a lot of times we still live in that old era of what we think people want. Again, I come back to that. Do we even know what a lot of the rights holders actually want? And are they telling us they want something? And we just have kind of ignored it because we don't really know if we can deliver.
Yeah, I think there is sort of a combination of both, but absolutely there is a lot of time, and not just the rights holder, but for the fans too. I think we make a lot of assumptions based on whether it's sitting in our own echo chamber or whether it's just sort of seeing and hearing the loudest voices and not really asking all the questions of what you want. And it's funny that you say that, because I was talking with someone earlier today about that, is that there's this concept that I don't see it as much as I used to, but I know you do as well, is build it and they will come. And that's just really not true. You can't plop a sports team in a major metropolis and just assume people will buy tickets. It just doesn't happen that way. You need to listen to what they're saying. And so there are teams that are doing it. You cited the example of MLS, and I'm not just saying it because, I spent, 7 years working for the Whitecaps, but I really respect some of the brands of what they did to sit down and listen to their demographic and their partners. So, teams like LAFC and Atlanta and Nashville and so on, who really listened to what they wanted and then built the brand around that. And look what happened. They became eminently successful. Nashville with Smashville, they did the same thing. They didn't have great hockey, but the fans wanted experience. And so they built that for them and became successful. But I do agree with you. It's still not as commonplace as it should be.
But the other issue that comes from this is we're still making assumptions based off of data, as I mentioned. A lot of times we don't want to actually see the data when it's hard because of, having the digital accessibility to new information, right? Of actual numbers might not coincide with what we've told the sponsor when we're telling them that they're going to get X, and then we actually get the real hardcore information, which is why streaming is usually something that while people will do, they don't want to cite a lot of times, because the streaming portal actually tells you, as opposed to maybe the assumptions that people were making off of traditional media of what you actually got out of it and what people actually saw.
I mean, there's an age-old saying that says, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." So I, I think you have to balance out how are you telling, your story while trying to use the data to tell it. Because to your point is, yeah, I mean, if you just lay data down on a piece of paper and just show a number, like I said, it's a bit open to interpretation on what you're trying to accomplish. So the digital one is an interesting one to cite because we all know that, we all talk about engagement numbers and that kind of stuff, but sometimes there's just not that level that's out there. People are not engaging in that way on whether it's Instagram or X/Twitter or Facebook or any of the other social ones that can give you, a lot of insights on people's participation. So in that regard, I think you have to find a way to either renew the data and how you're explaining it, or, start analyzing it in a much different way. Because to your point about the traditional, if there's one constant in the universe, it's change. So if you're staying with the traditional resources and the traditional views, at some point it just becomes antiquated, and it's definitely not telling the right story to your partners.
But is it necessarily telling the right story to your partners when it comes to a lot of these digital portals, especially when it comes to social media? I've got X on social media, but does that necessarily translate to what you're actually trying to get in terms of deliverables? Because a lot of the social media things have been exposed as having a lot of bots, a lot of people that aren't actually there, or a lot of non-buyers. It's usually a lot of people that want to complain about things, but are they? And I'm not poo-pooing social media or any of these types of constructs, but at the same time, you do have to kind of factor in: is this doing anything for your brand, or is this just something that people can get behind to get upset about your brand?
So I think the answer to that question really comes down to your concept of creativity. And I don't mean, yours, but as a rights holder, because, if you're selling an asset to a partner, when we talk about, we don't refer to it as sponsorships anymore. We talk about it as partnerships now. And I think a big piece of that is that, as a partnership, it's not just looking at one asset. It's looks at how you are building a package that can support, all the elements and pillars of your potential partners and rights holders. So to me, it's more about how are you approaching those assets and showing them how to leverage them, but without showing them, where they're at. Because part of your partners is also to help you grow that. You're trying to create programs that are leveraging the technology as opposed to selling the technology, if that makes sense.
So where do we transition all of this experience that you've had since we talked last? You were at the Whitecaps for 7 years. I think there's something global that happened during that time. I can't put my finger on it. How did that sell your changing of your selling techniques, but also how did that really impact how sponsors and brands viewed the in-person audience as opposed to the audience through other channels and portals?
Well, it forced everybody's hand, and we all definitely had our collective assets handed to us in so many ways because of what we talked about earlier. Is that the majority of what sponsors want to see are a lot of eyeballs, and when you're not playing in your own house or not playing games, or you're now under the guise of having to go under a different broadcaster stadium, it changed a lot. I think one thing that it definitely changed was the concept of how much clubs are investing, because you've put in, say, $100,000 per year on the low end, just to use a small example, and now you're saying I'm not getting that value because you're not playing games, but I'm telling you I'm not returning that money to you. How do you now showcase where that value is? So I think it forced everybody's hands to really look at what has actual real value. The other part too is I think that the human element really came into play. Is we're looking at all these changes in the business. You're looking at changes internally in your offices. You're looking at probably personal changes. Now things actually matter. And I think where that pushed partners' ideas is more into the community realm, and forced us to look at things that function outside of the stadium but still engage our fan base. Because we're just like, as MLS as an example, the Whitecaps, we didn't play. We didn't play at home for almost 2 years. And that means, all the assets that I've given to partners don't exist anymore. We were moving to either Florida or Portland in year 2. We're having to leverage what their stadium looks like. We're only being able to leverage a ton of virtual signage, but there's a certain limitation how much we have. So some partners just didn't get on there. And so you have to look at where your resources are. And realistically, the resources are sort of like back in the old school, boots on the ground, grassroots type of partnerships. And I think that that's what you're starting to see now is people don't want the digital. They don't want the visual. What they want is the actual participation with your fans. What are you doing to showcase the community good? How are you actually getting in front of them to show that you care? That to me was the biggest change.
Well, and this actually makes us maybe more creative. One thing that I think often hinders creativity is the idea that everything's going to come through.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, definitely had to get more creative and more thoughtful. And I think what that meant is really, the question you asked earlier about finding out what our rights holders want. In the end, we're still human beings, and there's still a concept that we have of how we want people to not just view our company, but view the efforts that we put forward. And so when you have to get creative, you have to start taking in account to those things. And I also think that sponsors became substantially more verbal about what they wanted because they were, I'm not going to say they were upset, but like all of a sudden there's this dramatic shift and change, and a lot of honesty came out. And as much as it hurt to hear, to your point earlier, when they're telling us that they don't care about the digital numbers and care about impressions, we did hear about what they really cared about. And I think that goes back to an earlier question, is learning more about what they want. Is we have to really start letting them have the opportunity to give us that honest feedback of what they really want to do as a partner and a rights holder, and less about us just closing the deal to make the sale and hit budget.
So where do we go from here, and where do we expand out to make sure that our acumen actually meets what the sponsors want?
Obviously having good relationships and open communication is good. I think two things are going to happen. One is the diversification of assets into smaller, more digestible and cost-effective pieces. I think you're going to lose ground on seeing, one, because I just don't think there's that much money that people want to spend where it used to be. But companies dropping $10 million on a 5-year partnership, there's only so many of those. But there's a lot of small companies that are starting to come to fruition with capital that want to invest in sports. And they might not be able to pay $1 million per year, but some of these can pay 150, 200,000. And so I think you're going to start seeing, and maybe even smaller partnerships, but I think you're going to start seeing things like, sports clubs finding a way to sell micro rights and micro IP, where it won't undercut the value of their major sponsors, but will give access and ability to smaller partners, so growing your demographic. And I think in that nature, you're going to have a lot more conversations, and more conversations means more data. So on the other side is, how are the business intelligence folks readapting from a fully quantitative way to research to more of a qualitative and emotional way to understand the research?
So then we have the buzzword AI. How does AI fit into all of this? And is it something that you and I can really understand or comprehend? Because it seems that Revenge of the Nerds has come out again. This is just like when we started using data analytics with everything. AI seems to have its own forefront. And a lot of times it doesn't use salespeople to do it.
So I would actually argue that it does. But here's the thing, is I think when we start using terms like AI and blockchain and NFT, they are certainly becoming buzzwords, which means that now it's just about, how are we using that word in explaining something? And I think it's such a general statement, like AI. What is AI? What does it mean? It's artificial intelligence. Well, great, but that's just two words. It doesn't tell you, how people are using it or how it applies to our business. I would argue that, we've been using AI in many ways for a number of years, when you're talking about how you're interacting with people and chatbots and stuff on your website. I mean, a chatbot is AI, and we've been using those for a decade with people connecting, whether it's through ticketing or fan engagement platforms or whatnot. I'm really big on new technology, and when it comes to AI, listen, the ball is already rolling on this. You cannot stop any of this from happening. So one is, I would tell anybody, you have to learn to find ways to engage with new technology, because you can't stop that. It's just happening. But But I think where artificial intelligence comes in as a benefit is it allows you to pick up speed in the essence of your communication. It allows you to ask more questions for something to find ways to interpret data, which you might not be able to do that because, AI is still a human construct. So when you're asking it questions, it's only pulling from all the data that's available to it. The downside is it's not going to come up with something new. But the upside is there's data that you can access that you might not have thought of that AI will potentially help you come up with. So I think there's a lot of benefit with it. As an asset class, that I'm not sure. I think we've got a long way to go. The same way that social media did, where when it first started, nobody really knew how to leverage it. So you're out there saying, hey, you should buy into this asset class. And people are saying, well, I don't know how it makes me money. I don't know how it leverages my brand. And I think that AI kind of sits in that right now. But in 2 or 3 years, when people really understand how to leverage it, you're going to see it open up as an asset class. But as a usability piece, it should be engaged immediately because there's so many opportunities for it to, whether it's responding to emails or helping your sales staff, come up with creative ways, becoming your own personal brainstorm, helping you react to marketplace and rebuild decks really quickly. There's a lot of opportunities for the technology to help us.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast. Been, quite a bit. Hopefully we don't make it another decade.
No, I'm actually, as you saw my LinkedIn post, and I've been sharing it with other friends, I'm really excited to see you come back and have the Tao Sports and Troy Kirby back in this space to share not just, your intelligence, but showcasing everybody else that we're connected to. And, anytime you want to chat, I'm more than happy to.
Wait a second. So I'm basically Elvis with the tabloids. I'm spotted in some mall in the South. That's essentially been it. I've just been in hiding.
Hey, listen, we've been asking. Anybody seen Troy? No idea where he went. I look at it more like you're like the, the classic blues man who disappears for 2 years and then, like Robert Johnson, nobody knew where he was and he comes back and suddenly he's the greatest guitarist that ever lived. So I can only imagine what you're going to be capable of doing after taking some time off to rethink stuff.
Oh gosh. Now I sold my soul to the devil and now I, basically am at the crossroads. This is great. Or
Correct.
There's going to be a lot of Troy Kirby impersonators in Vegas somehow. And that will be hard to live down. Yeah, Paul, always fun to, chat with you. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, pleasure is mine. And I look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you for listening to the Tao of Sports podcast, focusing on the world of sports business. Download our free iPhone, iPad app in the iTunes App Store, an Android app available in Amazon to listen to the entire archive. Or check out sportstao.com for more podcasts, blog posts, and videos. All episodes of the Tao of Sports podcast are copyrighted and trademarked.